So this video is about a very popular practice, at least between people like us who, if you're watching this, you probably have some degree of spiritual practice. You may have seen it from Eckhart Tolle, but it really does go back to practically every Eastern philosophical tradition that I'm aware of. And that is the practice of focusing on the gaps between thoughts themselves. And you can think of this as like cars on a freeway. And so most of us ordinary people, during our ordinary days, we focus on the things, we focus on the cars. This practice has us shift that focus from the thoughts to the gaps between them. And you can get pretty good at this, and you can notice that there actually are moments of stillness in between the thoughts, in between the things that typically occupy our attention. And if you start this practice, you might notice that it can be a very fleeting, very quick moment. It's kind of like you're on the beach and you dig into the sand and you create a little bit of emptiness, but then the water quickly fills it. And so you go trying to dig deeper, maybe and create more emptiness, but the water just quickly fills it. And those thoughts, it's like our attention it's like a gravitational pull towards things. And so the practice can be it can be difficult at first. So I want to give you a couple hints and suggestions, and then go a little advanced. Some of this is about attention itself, and our normal, everyday attention that centers around a thinking mind is like a very tiny spotlight, and it's usually focused on objects to try to achieve some kind of goal. But the interesting thing about that spotlight is that in neuroscience, there's even a couple neuroscientists themselves that are suggesting that the brain itself is a filter for reality. In other words, there's this kind of vastness of reality, and the brain is filtering that all down, so that little spotlight can focus on one thing at a time. And it's going to be interesting to see how that turns out, because there is a certain paradox with that as far as the science is concerned. I mean, how do you show, using the filter, because that's what these scientists are using, that there's something beyond the filter? But in any case, the gap is a great place to start. But we can take it a little bit further than this, and this is where I want to go, because if you've watched a few of my videos, it can come across as that I'm very, it sounds like I've pointed towards the thinking mind as the enemy. And I really don't want to give that impression. When you start off, it's a good place to start. If you've ever heard the old Zen story, it's one of my favorites. It's a way that was a person described their spiritual journey. And he said, before enlightenment, trees were trees and mountains were mountains. And then during enlightenment, trees were no longer trees and mountains were no longer mountains. But then after enlightenment, trees were trees and mountains were mountains. And it's a really interesting way to put it, because we can think about that as with the thinking mind. Before this, you say, well, I'm not the thinking mind. That's your, well, at the beginning you say, well, everyone's identified with the thinking mind. Then you make a little bit of progress. You focus on the gaps between thoughts, and then well, I'm not the thinking mind. And then at some point you realize that actually you are the thinking mind. And it's a trick of attention. What I'm getting at is, imagine, again, go back to the beach, and you're digging in the sand, and you're noticing that every time you dig and create some emptiness, the water just quickly fills that gap. And that's the way the thinking mind seems to be. So, and it feels so antagonistic, like it's the thinking mind against the thinking mind. But the interesting thing about focusing on the gaps, and the interesting thing about focusing on space and emptiness, is that it's unlike anything else the thinking mind deals with. It's unlike anything that attention deals with, because there's nothing there. There could be no judgment about space. There are no qualities of space. And so what happens is that spotlight can actually it can become more, and it can widen, and from a very tiny little kind of focused on things to the gaps, to realizing that it's actually the whole picture. It's the gaps and the things all happening at once. In other words, to go back to the beach and imagine, you're digging and getting frustrated because the water keeps filling these gaps and emptiness that you're creating, or at least noticing. When attention becomes a certain openness, all of a sudden you realize that actually you're the ocean. You're the one filling in the gaps. In other words, the thinking mind is not some antagonistic enemy to be overcome. You're the thinking mind just as much as you're the gap between the thoughts themselves. You're the whole process. Like in the other video I was mentioning, there's no such thing as something that's artificial. To think of something as artificial is an illusion. It's all grown out of the same process. We might call it consciousness, we might call it nature. And that's the really interesting part of all of this. And I know it's a little bit advanced, but that's the kind of circle that happens. You become completely identified with the thinking mind, then you realize you're not your thinking mind, and then you go back and you realize that you're actually the whole thing. You are the thinking mind, you're the gaps between the thoughts, and that's really the way it's always been.